They say Rome wasn't built in a day, but what the historians conveniently forget to mention is that it was built on the backs of children whose screams were muffled by marble walls and drowned out by the clinking of coins in the slave markets. Picture this. While senators debated philosophy in their pristine togas, a 10-year-old girl from Gaul was being stripped naked on a platform, her body poked and prodded like cattle, her teeth examined as if she were livestock up for auction. This wasn't an anomaly. This was Tuesday in the Roman Empire. The same civilization that gave us aqueducts and literature also perfected the art of breaking children before they could even understand what was being taken from them. Welcome to the underbelly of Roman glory, where power wasn't just proclaimed in triumphant marches, it was enforced in the trembling hands of prepubescent girls who had their entire existence reduced to a price tag hanging around their necks. The moment a Roman legion conquered a new territory, the soldiers didn't just claim land, they claimed people, and they were particularly interested in the young ones. Girls between 10 and 15 were considered prime merchandise, not because they were strong laborers, but because they were moldable, breakable, and profitable in ways that would make your skin crawl. These children were classified as predabooty, spoils of war, objects the instant Roman boots entered their villages. Imagine being ripped from your mother's arms, watching your father cut down in front of you, and then being herded into a pen with dozens of other terrified children, all while some Roman officer casually discussed whether you'd fetch a better price in Rome or Pompeii. The military didn't just permit this, they encouraged it. After all, enslaved children were part of the soldiers' payment package, a grotesque bonus for a job well done. These girls were stripped of their native clothes, inspected for defects like you'd examine a horse, and branded literally, burned with hot iron with marks indicating who owned them or where they came from. The scar wasn't just physical. It was a permanent reminder that they were no longer human beings, but property with an expiration date. The historical sources don't sugarcoat this nightmare. Plutarch, that supposedly civilized Roman biographer, casually mentioned how during campaigns in Pontus, so many people were enslaved that slave prices crashed like some perverted ancient stock market. Too much supply, apparently. Tacitus wrote about Jewish girls being paraded through Rome in chains after Jerusalem fell, displayed like trophies during General Titus's triumph, before being sold off to the highest bidder. But here's the truly disgusting part. This wasn't considered unusual or barbaric by Roman standards. This was normal. This was Tuesday. The trauma didn't end with capture. It merely began there. These girls were marched for weeks across hostile terrain, often with minimal food and water, their feet bleeding, their bodies failing, while their captors debated which route would be fastest to the slave markets. Many didn't survive the journey. Those who did arrived at holding camps, where they waited in squalor diseases spreading through cramped quarters before finally being dragged to the Venalitia, the slave markets that made the Forum. Orium is much a place of human suffering, as it was a center of commerce. Standing on the catasta, that raised platform where human beings were displayed like merchandise, these girls faced a new horror: public examination. Roman law actually permitted buyers to strip enslaved people completely to verify their condition. And for young girls, this meant enduring invasive scrutiny from crowds of leering men who checked their teeth like they were horses, examined their skin for blemishes, and assessed their bodies with the cold calculation of livestock traders. They wore placards around their necks titularly that listed their age, origin, and any defects, though these descriptions were usually lies. Sellers had every incentive to hide signs of trauma, rebellion, or illness, and since most of these girls couldn't read Latin, they had no idea what lies were being advertised about them. The market for young female slaves was particularly robust, not because of their labor potential, but because wealthy Romans wanted them for domestic service, a euphemism that barely conceals the sexual exploitation that often accompanied household duties. They were purchased to be maids, yes, but also wet nurses for children, they'd never claim as their own personal attendants who had to. Anticipate every whim and objects of gratification for masters who faced zero legal consequences for anything they chose to do to their human property. The transaction was simple. Coins exchanged hands, and a girl's entire existence transferred to a new dominus, a master whose word was law, whose cruelty faced no check, whose desires took precedence over her survival. Some girls were sold multiple times throughout their lives, each sale further erasing whatever shreds of identity they'd managed to preserve. There was no ceremony marking this moment, no acknowledgement of the life being destroyed, just a sharp command in a language they barely understood the weight of a chain around their wrist or neck, and the indifferent stare of a new owner who'd already forgotten their face by the time they reached his villa. The Roman slave market didn't just trade in bodies, it consumed souls, silenced voices that had barely learned to speak, and institutionalized a system where childhood offered no sanctuary, innocence provided no protection, and suffering was so normalized that historians would later write about it with the same detached tone they used to describe architectural achievements. Once purchased, these girls entered the Roman domus, those magnificent villas with their pristine courtyards and elaborate frescoes, not as guests, but as ghosts. They were called ancilla, female domestic slaves, a term that sounds almost quaint until you understand what it actually meant. You belong to us now, body and soul, and your life will be structured entirely around our comfort. Every moment of their existence was governed by commands they couldn't refuse. Wake before dawn to light the fires. Fetch water from the cistern. Prepare the morning meal. Attend the mistress while she bathes. Comb her hair, arrange her jewelry, help her dress, all while remaining absolutely silent unless spoken to. The Roman household operated like a miniature empire, with the paterfamilias wielding absolute power and enslaved girls positioned at the very bottom of an already brutal hierarchy. They were considered too young to be trusted with important tasks, but too valuable to waste on simple labor, so they were assigned to intimate personal service, the kind that required them to witness every private moment of their owners' lives while being granted none of their own. Privacy was a luxury reserved for citizens. These girls slept wherever there was space in corners of the kitchen where the stone floor bruised their bones, in cramped storerooms that reeked of oil and grain, or literally at the foot of their mistress's bed like human furniture. They ate only after everyone else had finished, and only whatever scraps remained, which some nights meant nothing at all. They weren't permitted to leave the house without explicit permission, and when they did accompany their owners to the baths or temples or social gatherings, they had to remain invisible, present but silent, attentive but unseen, always ready to serve but never acknowledged as human. The psychological torture of this existence is almost harder to fathom than the physical brutality. Imagine spending years in a house, knowing every room intimately, yet belonging nowhere. Imagine raising children with more tenderness than their own mother showed them, only to be discarded the moment you are no longer useful. Some girls were trained in specific skills: music, embroidery, basic medicine, but only if their owners saw profit in it. The vast majority were taught just enough Latin to understand orders and threats, while their native languages, the last connection to who they'd been before capture, were actively suppressed. Disobedience, even accidental, brought punishment that would make modern people sick. The paterfamilias held vita nessus potestas, the power of life and death, over everyone in his household, including slaves. Roman law didn't just allow the abuse of enslaved people. It protected the abuser and ensured the victim had no recourse whatsoever. Seneca, that supposedly enlightened Stoic philosopher, wrote that we abuse our slaves as though they were not men, capturing with disturbing clarity how normalized this cruelty had become. A girl could be whipped for breaking a dish, for failing to wake quickly enough, for speaking when not spoken to, for showing fear or hesitation or any emotion her master found inconvenient. The lash was so common that writers mentioned it casually, the way we might mention turning on a light switch. Pliny the Younger described overseers stationed throughout estates with whips always at hand, ready to maintain discipline at a moment's notice. For young girls, these punishments often occurred in private spaces, where humiliation compounded the physical pain, in kitchens, where their screams would undisturb the dinner guests, in storerooms where no one would witness their degradation, in secluded courtyards where the only audience was other. Slaves who learned long ago that intervening meant sharing the punishment. But some punishments were deliberately public, designed to terrorize everyone else into compliance. A girl might be chained in a visible area of the house, forced to perform exhausting labor while the rest of the household went about their day, a living reminder that resistance was futile. Some masters branded their slaves with "Fug fugitivus," runaway burned into their foreheads or shoulders, marking them permanently as property that had attempted escape. The lex aliacentia even allowed for the execution of slaves accused of conspiracy or of striking their masters. And while young girls were rarely executed, the threat hung over them constantly. This wasn't discipline in any meaningful sense. It was systematic psychological demolition designed to break the will before the body gave out. Through fear, through pain, through the elimination of hope, Rome maintained its vast machinery of human suffering. For a tiny fraction of these girls, manumission legal freedom offered a sliver of possibility. But let's be clear, this wasn't justice. It was occasional mercy granted at the master's whim. Freedom might come after decades of faithful service, or if a girl bore children for her master and he wanted to legitimize his offspring, or if she became so indispensable that keeping her technically enslaved became inconvenient. Even then, freedom came with chains of its own. Freed slaves became liberté freedwomen, but they remained tied to their former owners, now called patroni. They owed continued loyalty, labor, and often a portion of their earnings. They took the family's name, erasing whatever identity they might have preserved. Some managed to marry, run small businesses, raise freeborn children who wouldn't inherit their mother's trauma. Tomb inscriptions occasionally celebrate these rare success stories, former slaves who found dignity in freedom. But these were exceptions so rare they proved the rule. For the overwhelming majority of young female slaves in Rome, freedom was a fantasy. Manumission, a word that described someone else's distant future and survival, meant learning to endure the unendurable, while something essential inside you slowly died. Rome called itself the pinnacle of civilization, the light of the Western world, the foundation upon which modern society was built. And technically, that's true, but we rarely acknowledge what that foundation was made of. It was made of girls whose names we'll never know, whose screams echoed through marble halls before being forgotten by history, whose entire existence was reduced to a transaction recorded in some merchant S-ledger and then lost to time. The empire's power wasn't just carved in stone and conquered territories. It was carved into flesh, into the bodies and psyches of children who were consumed by a system that viewed them as renewable resources. Their silence shaped Rome's grandeur, made possible the philosophy and art and engineering we still celebrate today. And that silence echoes still, a reminder that civilization's gleaming surface often conceals foundations built on unspeakable suffering. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the glory of Rome, about its contributions to law, progress at what cost? And what does it say about us that we built our entire concept of Western civilization on an empire that commodified children and called it normal?